Hi there, welcome to this Cloud Native Skunkworks deep dive into Kubescape. Kubescape is a tool by ARMO, and ARMO is a company which is focusing heavily on the supply chain security space within Kubernetes. I'm really excited because this is emblematic of a slew of new ways to solve problems with developers getting their hands on K8s clusters, maybe not necessarily following the guidance or being oblivious to some of the risks that can be incurred on these clusters. So what's really interesting, as we'll see today, is that when companies like ARMO come along and release tools like Kubescape, they are trying to build for developers to make that really embedded into the ecosystem and really a bit of success where they can just go off and run something and instantly they can see whether or not there are vulnerabilities that have been introduced with their code and with their configuration. So let's take a quick look at it. I came across Kubescape from the GitHub angle, and we'll get onto that for a moment, but I wanted to introduce ARMO and what they are and what they represent. First and foremost, ARMO as a company only released Kubescape in August, so this is a recent development for me to hear about. But what was interesting is that their pedigree comes from this idea of trying to embody DevSecOps operations and behaviors into everyday developers. So making the tooling, as I described, as easy as possible to use. And as we can see from their website here, they are very much following that philosophy in how they think about presenting themselves to the community. So there's a real onus here on UX-driven control with a companion CLI for DevOps personas and SRE personas. One of the other things that really took my eye straight away is we're talking about frameworks, and suddenly I see that you get attack types, which are coming up on the framework names. And this is really interesting to me because the idea that you can start to inoculate against an attack type is really interesting. So if you imagine being at a large enterprise customer right now, and you have your manager breathing down your neck saying, "Hey, what about log4shell? Are we protected against that?" I imagine that one of the ambitions of Kubescape might be with ARMO to effectively create a framework around the known components of that vulnerability. So for me, this was really interesting to see that. And also another thing that I found really cool when I was browsing this website straight away was this visualization feature. And this just blows my mind because it takes me back to things like WeaveScope in the past where you could start to see resources. But as we'll come on to see later in this little exploration, this goes way further. And actually, as somebody that's had to try and fine grain and figure out who's in your cluster and what permissions they have, this is such a godsend. Like, this is so useful. I can't express it enough. So I'll have a look at that later on, and we can start to think about how this all pulls together. And one final thing, which I thought was really cool, was if you go into the video here, at about sort of like 55 seconds into that video, when it starts to describe how you use the CLI, as we'll come to see, the CLI is very similar to the UX experience. And from my point of view, I love the idea that anything I can do in the CLI and vice versa can come back out again. And as our first port of call will show us, going through the Kubescape CLI into the UX is super, super simple. So that's my kind of whistle-stop tour of who ARMO is. Let's really focus on what is this Kubescape thing that I've just mentioned. Well, Kubescape is an open source tool for testing Kubernetes security. And rather than me just parrot that off, let's just go visit the GitHub repository. And one of the things I was laughing about to a friend is saying that this is probably one of the best repositories I've ever seen, in that it's just so clean, right? It's got all the right shields, it's got a good level of contributors, and it has a really simple installer, which I always appreciate having like a one-liner, because I don't have a lot of time to evaluate these things. So if I'm helped by the team to just say, "Hey, yeah, get up and going with this," it's really awesome. And again, I super appreciate there being demos and Mac-friendly installables. I haven't tried this for Linux, but I assume you could use Linux Brew as well to install the Kubescape, or you could do it like an apt package or something like that. So I've installed this already, and the first thing that I did was I just literally ran the first command. Whilst that's running, what would be interesting to look at is kind of what is the Kubescape mission and what is it trying to do? Well, we know that ARMO are focused a lot around the DevSecOps pipeline ecosystem behaviors and personas. What Kubescape specifically is solving for is the execution of those frameworks, the aggregation of different built-in risk and rule sets, and being able to figure out if your files and if your cluster has that kind of risk. Now, this is really important to distinguish Kubescape from other products, is that this is looking at a cluster scope. It's not looking at a single manifest file. It's looking for files deployed within that cluster. So just to give an example of why I think this is specifically quite useful, if we go to our cluster here, right? Especially in a multi-tenanted environment, you may have, if you're running an OpenShift, a namespace per customer or a namespace per tenant. And equally, if you've carved out your own system, you might have something similar where you have this multi-tenant approach. And it is really difficult when you go down this sort of approach to manage the quality of every single manifest. Let's say that we extrapolate this to being 100 users who are deploying things out from a centralized CI/CD. Now, this might be the case that I say I have 100 namespaces with a one-to-one mapping of one per user, and then I also might have probably 30 clusters. So my previous experience working at places, we've had anywhere upward from 30 to 70 Kubernetes clusters. So manually auditing this at the CI/CD level is possible, but then that's not really the running state, is it? Because the charts can change, and there's going to be a delta when you have operators working in those clusters. For example, a human operator can come along from one of these teams, and quite rightfully they can say, hey, you know what, I'm going to change something in my namespace. I might change a service type from a cluster IP to a load balancer, and that would be within their rights. However, this now is drifting from our pre-scanning phase in the CI/CD, and so that the Helm chart or the manifest that's deployed is no longer representative of the state in the cluster. So I think there's a real need for products like Kubescape because it gives us this not only active scanning technique, but it also gives you holistic scanning. So I would say that's the Kubescape boundary. So that was why I was excited about it, because it gave us that real-time in-cluster scanning capability, which just takes less off of my plate, and more off of my plate, and it means that there's more automation involved in all this. So I've spoken for a little while there. If we go back down to that first command, you see that I've run here, which is the scan framework NSA, and quite helpfully here, this takes you to a US government website where it talks through best practice for hardening guidance. So this framework runs the best practice hardening guidance, I would presume. And so what we can see on my left here, and I'll just scale this up just to be sure that everyone can watch this, is that there's a whole bunch of stuff on my cluster that I've done wrong. So for example, I've deployed out a file server into my default namespace, as well as some other bits and pieces. And what's really cool is that you have either that synopsis, or you can go down and look at exactly what are the issues. Now, my terminal's been scaled up a few different times here, but when you run this, it prints out really nicely, and you can see in a little table what's going on. Now, let's just try running that again. In fact, let's try something else. I see you've got the MITRE attack here as well. So we'll do a submit, which is really cool. And again, it's actually surprisingly quick. One of the things that never ceases to amaze me is that for the amount of resources and YAML files that this is scanning, it's able to go through them very, very quickly. And again, I'll just show you the cluster that I've got. This cluster is just a really simple Kubernetes vanilla cluster. In fact, it's running on K3s. I've got almost nothing running in it. I've just got a little file server that hosts my example files for this file server on cloud-native-skunkworks.io, and that's all that's running on there. And so it's detected that that's a vulnerability by running it in the default namespace, and it's also detected a few other things. So that's pretty cool straight off that it's picked those out. What I also want to do now is to just really quickly, let's go back and actually have a look at what are the kind of bits of information that it's telling us about. Privileged containers. If you've worked with Jaeger tracing, you'll often see that with Jaeger, folks end up putting admin or root permissions on those sidecars, list Kubernetes secrets. So there are things in this cluster, there are certain subjects in this cluster that can list Kate's secrets. And again, that's a high risk thing to be able to do. And it's pulling all these out and identifying them for me, which is really, really interesting to see. So from there, you might think, well, you know, what else can you do? If we go back to our page here, the examples here are heavily around the scanning side of things. And then it comes into more of the DevOpsy side of, okay, well, what do you want to output those into JSON, to YAML, to XML, or even Prometheus metrics format, which I thought was really cool as well, because then we can start to think about scraping the result of these. But what, in fact, I think is worthwhile looking at now is this yellow text here, which is you can see the UX friendly results in the UI. Now, all I've done ahead of this is to register myself with an account, and that was just through Google Auth, right? Instantly, I've got 2 clusters that are appearing on this page. I know they're my 2 clusters because I can see here it's my CNS Cloud Native Skunkworks cluster, and then I had a kind cluster as well when I first started playing around with this. So this is totally different now, right? I'm suddenly in a UI experience. I can see this multi-cluster thing going on, and then if we click into this CNS cluster, what's really interesting is that we have one of these 3 plus frameworks selected. I go out, I can see that at the high level, I can see my risk has gone down over time. And this is cool because as we saw just here, we're collecting more data points. Every time we're running the security scanner, we're generating those data points, and the SaaS platform is retaining those data points. So there's a real value add here in that you can do a quick snapshot of what's going on in the world, like what's my risk profile look like on the left in the CLI, versus if I want to come back and store historical data, I can look to the right. And at this point, I think it's worth breaking because this is exactly the kind of thing that enterprise organizations are really, really hungry for. It's historical, auditable data that shows your risk profile over time, with the idea that you can come back and look at how you did at any one time in comparison to other clusters, other departments, and other teams. And this goes further to say that I think, as we'll go on to see in the rest of the video, some of the ambition here with the Kubescape platform is to really bring folks together to have this holistic single pane of glass security and software supply chain security profiling suite. So I'm really interested at this point in time as to where they're going to take the product, but it's exciting because it definitely looks like it's with the mindset of you can scale this up to 100 clusters and overlay those clusters and compare them, and to also pull the alarm bells if suddenly, like, say 50% of those clusters introduce a new threat that spikes on all the frameworks. So let's go back for now and have a bit more of a poke around in this UX. So I have my 2 clusters. The first page we get is called risk. This risk homepage is kind of self-explanatory. These look to be the default built-in frameworks that we saw inside of the CLI tool, which is great because I like it when there's no voodoo. So we go Kubescape on my left. We can see that we've got the scan. And if I run the scan by default, I'm not sure what it's going to run by default. I presume it's going to run everything, or it might just run something out of default. But what we could do is, if we look here, it says, okay, 3 different supported frameworks on the scan, and as you can see, those 3 different supported frameworks come up there. So that makes perfect sense. As we go back into this cluster, I would imagine that we will start to see more data points popping up, because I've just started running scans. So today is the 23rd. We can see we run a bunch of scans today on the 23rd. What is really interesting to me is that I look for the colors, right? And the colors of, like, something's going well, something's going badly. So having these big clear icons of passed and failed is really good. And what I like as well is if you click into one of these, you can actually turn them off, which is pretty useful. For example, I like that it's warning me about running a container in the default namespace. But at the same time, I don't really care, because to me, in this little toy cluster that I'm going to have around for a few days, it's not the end of the world. So if we just sort out by severity, let's see if I can figure out which ones I want to turn off. I'm going to go to, in fact, let's pick one here. Let's pick the Nginx issue here. And this is an issue where effectively users can create Nginx objects that can interact with the secrets of the cluster. We'll leave that one on. Let's take this one here. So this is mapping of service accounts. And I'm going to add that with an exception for Cert Manager. So the next time it scans, it won't pull the alarm bells and say, hey, this is something that's gone wrong. And this is something I can totally see large companies having to tune based on their appetite for risk and on their threat modeling. So that's really interesting to me. Also, that you can turn these off is kind of fun as well. And then, of course, my psyche is drawing me to this Add Frameworks button. And then, I'm suddenly interested in how do I create my own framework. And this is where you're taken to the settings page. So the settings page is also available from here on the top right of the Kubescape SaaS portal, but you can also then it can be opened through that link. And suddenly I'm presented with all this stuff I didn't know existed. So I can effectively create my own framework that will just think about, say, two interesting things that I really care about, like port forwarding and non-root containers. And I can add those to my Alex framework, and then I can run my Alex framework next time, which is really cool. Another thing in this that I like, and this will come on to touch this at the end, is that you can then integrate this back into Slack. And I think from the website, they were showing that they were going to do it. There is a whole bunch of other stuff that ARMO's doing to integrate with ITSM tooling, to integrate with a number of downstream systems as well. Because I think, again, this is where I see this really being placed, is that you've got almost, let's draw it out, I would think, you've got your CI/CD pipeline here, as we described down there. So CI/CD, I don't know why I'm using this stroke style. You have your deployment, and then you have almost Kubescape being run as a continuous feedback tool, because especially if you're using a company that's using something like ServiceNow or other gating systems, you would want to have the ability to then revoke production release permission on a certain condition, right? If the risk profile exceeds 80 or something like that, because this could very well mean that you're incorporating some sort of risk that wasn't considered. And again, this might be part of that two-step process. Identify risk level. So again, there are many use cases, but that's the first one that comes to my mind, is that Kubescape is seating itself right in the middle here, which is really cool. So we've talked about the cluster page, we've talked about the initial UX being, very straightforward in what it is. Now, this is where it starts to get interesting. There are some features here on the left which came in whilst I was reviewing this that changed the game for me, right? They completely changed my opinion of where this product is and how it sits in, its place in the ecosystem, because there are two big things that have been introduced. You've got image scanning and RBAC visualization. Image scanning, which is fantastic. It's a feature that we kind of take for granted, but they're always disparate tooling, right? It's always, there's an image scanning tool, there would be an RBAC calculation tool, there might be some other manual gating around risk, or maybe people use OPA. It's interesting I mentioned OPA actually. OPA has become like the de facto tool, so open policy agent, for managing policy in a human readable language, right, through Rego files. If you scroll right to the bottom, you'll notice that Kubescape is based on OPA. And that was one of the things in my initial analysis for this video, my research, filled me with a lot of confidence. I worked with OPA Gatekeeper previously, and had a lot of success in being able to codify a lot of those behaviors that we wanted to see inside of our clusters, and those that we did not. And seeing that Kubescape is predicated on that technology fills me with a lot of confidence. But equally, now to see that they're investing into the image scanning side of things is really cool as well. So first things first, I care about criticals, right? I'm a cluster administrator. I can see my kind cluster is full of issues. And we can see if we go into that, these are the issues that are coming up. So different components. And this is super interesting as well, because looking at the different layers or the slices within an image is important, because there will be effectively opportunities at different image layers to introduce different kinds of remediation, right? And that could be, in very real terms, changing your base image. That could be disabling in the Docker file the ability to do an apt-get on startup. Some people do that when it's getting built. It could be as much as to actually create a composite of multi-part build images that are from a integrity-checked repository, rather than pulling them off the internet, as so many people do. So this is really cool. I like this. There's this has fixes thing as well. And if you click down to here, this was something that it took me a little while to find, but I actually love it. Is this idea that you can go down and see, precisely what's going on and whether there's a remediation suggestion around that issue. I won't go into them too much right now, but what's nice is you have the has fixes, and then you've also got this RCE, and the RCE is, effectively there's going to be like a remote code execution. If there's something that's super serious, then you can go in and see what's going on. So let's go back into the daemon set kube proxy, and you can see here I've got a lot of extensive information, but also some ideas of when to fix, if there's a fix available. And this is really, really fantastic. And it comes to my mind that I mentioned something about this in another video, where I like the idea of there being almost an opinionated set of steps to perform. And you start to see that Kubescape is giving you some examples of what's a good solution, right? So what's the fix we should move to? We've got to remember that, often a lot of the folks who are looking at this won't necessarily be, head in the weeds, senior engineers working on the code. They may be SecOps engineers, they may be analysts who have been tasked to maintain this. And so making their lives easier by suggesting an auto-remediation remediation is really, really necessary. And especially because you're starting to then open up the tooling and the platform for more potential types of use case as well. So image scanning is really interesting to me. I love this idea that we are able to see historically over time what's going on, and it's one less tool that I have to integrate into my workflow. So finally, with Risk image scanning, we have a second beta feature, and I think this is for me what really changed everything. The ability to start using the graphing capabilities and being able to see what's going on in my cluster adds a new type of ease of use that before was a real pain. I mentioned there were tools in the past such as Weavescope that could help you figure stuff out. However, here, Kubescape already asked the question on your behalf. It asked the question, who can do this? Like this is phenomenal to me. And I maybe I get too excited about this, but it is such a pain trying to figure things out that are like this. So for example, show subjects with the highest privileges. I want to layer, so I want to layer the same type of objects, align them, do a refresh. And now what we can do, if I click on this, second time I've done this, I think, here we go, is I can see who has access to do what and who has the highest privileges of that access. So I can see that within my cluster, the service manager, the cert manager, service accounts have an extremely high level of access, and then you can see the rest of them are coming from the kube system namespace. And there is one outlier here, which is still in kube system. But you can imagine, if we come back to that example, how much easier your day is going to be when you have tooling like this that can help you visualize it. Equally, there's some really interesting stuff like roles. I want to see user directly. Those are roles that are important to me, and it will highlight those, right? So the user roles are now actually being highlighted versus the service accounts. This is something that I think is best represented in a slightly larger cluster, because you can start to really cut through things. It's fully interactive as well, and I've been pulling this around just because it's fun. It reminds me of using GraphViz, and I think it's really cool from an administrator point of view to be able to do this. But also, I imagine in the future, the ambition will be to take this further into maybe exporting this data or to alerting on this data in particular configurations. And again, who's got cluster admin? Really simple things, but they're so important to have a firm holding on. So I've spoken a little bit about the RBAC, the image scanning, the risk part of the platform. I thought what would be interesting now would be to start looking at what are some of these use cases beyond just a simple cluster. Well, I have my cluster here on the left, and as I mentioned earlier on, we can go off and run this cluster. We can also install things on this cluster. I'm going to go ahead and just grab something, right? So if I just grab Nginx, and let's just install that there. So Helm install, and we'll put that in kube system just to be controversial. Okay, so after I've done this, I would want to run a scan. So if we come back to that idea of when would you be running this, well, you could run Kubescape periodically. You could run it directly as part of your deployment pattern. And in fact, the way that I'm thinking of running it would be having it in a canary cluster. So the way it could potentially work is deploy Helm chart. So that's your kind of your step one. Your step 0 is deploy the canary cluster. And if you think about things like kind, and you can see that I've been working with kind, it can be really quick. So deploy canary cluster, deploy Helm chart, run Kubescape scan, and then we take the result of the scan and we do something with it, right? We either pass-fail. So it's a gate. And that's phenomenal progress on where we are now, because you're not just scanning purely against those frameworks, you also have the image scanning on top of that, and you have then the double click into the cluster RBAC on the persistent production clusters to make sure that's not changed. So it's defined to be the crucible of where we can start to figure out the quality of our manifests and our configurations and our application code that gets deployed out. And that's important as well, because 9 times out of 10, the images that you're deploying to a cluster are going to be your application code within those images. And it's super important to be able to see this together. One of the final things that I think is worth mentioning as well is, in the future, I'm really excited to see this idea that potentially we have a single pane of glass. I mentioned that earlier on. I think this could become that, and I see a lot of these features in the same product already simplifying my journey. Genuinely speaking, there have been times when I've had to log into 6 or 7 different tools to figure out these kind of results. I mentioned using image scanning, right? So that's twist lock you have to then install in your cluster, and then you use it through the UX that has to have an ingress set up. You might have a simplified RBAC, not visualizer, but perhaps lister on who has roles and permissions. We might run Popeye as well to look at cluster integrity. But really, these are all a very fractious and disparate journey, whereas if I can then go through in a single experience to figure out what's going on here, this really starts to build a case for why I can see Kubescape used at enterprise. But what's really exciting to me as well is that from an individual contributor's point of view, I might want to come down here and just run a scan, right? I might just work for an open source project and just want to scan something. And I don't necessarily think that the stuff that I'm working on warrants needing to use the UX much, but at the same time, if I can see there's been a regression and I've got this in my GitHub Actions, I'll think, you know what? I totally want to do something about that. Especially when you'll see really simple stuff comes up that that you can flag, right? So I can see now in my namespace of Kube system, I have Nginx that I deployed that has now failed. And the load balancer for Nginx has failed as well, which is interesting to me because I can start to see what went wrong. So really, really important stuff. I think that the future here is extremely bright because it's such a necessity to start to educate engineers on how this can be pivotal, but also really easy to use and improve the overall quality of their work. So I hope you like this deep dive today. I've gone through effectively Kubescape, the CLI, ARMO, the team, the company, and Kubescape, the platform, and what they're trying to do with both of these parts of the product. I also think specifically from my own personal experience, it excites me because having this single pane of supply chain security glass is really, really exciting, because it means that as we start to see more attacks like Log4Shell, as we start to see MITRE attacks, we can really proactively make sure that they are being scanned and compensated within our clusters. Now we've seen 3 tools, right? We've seen the risk analysis portion, we've seen the image scanning and RBAC. As those features start to grow together in a more cohesive and collaborative manner, you'll be able to do multi-layers of operations at one time. You might be able to see or identify a rule that has been breached or a control that is not working, and you might also identify that control with a particular layer on a Docker image, and therefore you know that to remediate this, you can then go and change that image base version. So I think that it's going to be a phenomenal product to keep an eye on in the near future. I've already started using it in some of my GitHub Actions because it's free, it works, and I get to use the benefit of the UX as well. As someone who works in procurement or a larger company, I'd be definitely keeping my eye on this because, as I said, this solves many headaches. I'm excited for what's to come, and if you've liked this video, please do like and subscribe. Leave any comments at the end. I always love to read them. And yeah, see you soon. Thank you.